So got the sun shining in. All right, a little better. Morning, everyone. So today, as you can see, the sun is shining right on my head. Today, we're going to be starting a new Masechta Mishnayos, Masechta Trumas. Truma, as we know, there's an obligation that every year from the new crops, the person has to give a certain amount to the Kohen. And before you separate the truma from the crop is called tevel. It's forbidden for you to eat. And it remains forbidden until you separate the truma. When you separate the truma, which according to Torah can be any amount, according to rabbinic law, it's either 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th. Once you separate the truma, the rest of the grain is now permissible to eat. The truma, though, is sanctified and only may be eaten by the Kohen. And truma has to be separated. You have to take a certain amount of your grain and separate it for truma to give to the Kohen. So that is what that's what this Masechta, this tractate, is about. And the first Mishnah we're going to learn, Parak Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, deals with some laws regarding the actual separating of the truma. Actually, who may separate or whose separating actually works. So let's read the Mishnah. Chamisha lo yitremu. There are 5 people who cannot or may not or should not separate truma. V'mitarmu, and if they were to do it, ein trumas and truma. The truma is not a valid truma. It doesn't count for anything. It will not help. What you separate will not have the status of truma, and that which you separated from will still remain tevel, still remain forbidden for you to eat. Okay, who are these 5 people? Let's just read through the Mishnah first. Hacherish, a person who is deaf. Actually, in this context, it means a deaf mute. V'ashaita, someone who's deranged. V'hakatan, a minor. V'atayim eshe'ena shalai, or if you separate truma from grain that doesn't belong to you. Yisrael, a non-Jew who separated the grain of a Jew, afila b'rishus, even with the Jew's permission, ein trumas a truma, that truma does not count as a truma. So we have here 5 people that if they separate truma, it won't work, it won't count, it won't make any difference, nothing will change. The commentary Bar Tanura explains that the basis of this Mishnah really comes off a verse in the Torah that was not dealing with truma per se, the truma of grain per se, was actually dealing with the donations towards the building of the tabernacle. The Torah calls that separation truma. And based on that, the sages understood that whatever people would have been excluded from donating donating materials towards the construction of the Mishkan, that's what the Torah talks about. It talks about how Hashem says to Moshe, tell the Jewish people to donate materials for the construction of the Mishkan. And based on the words of that verse, we derive from there which people could donate, which people couldn't donate. The fact that the Torah calls it truma teaches us that those same people who were excluded from donating towards the construction of the Mishkan are also excluded from being able to separate the truma from grain. Let's go through each one. Hacherish. Cherish literally means someone who's deaf. But in this context, the commentaries say it means a deaf mute. A deaf mute was not able to contribute towards the Mishkan. The reason is because the Torah talks about a person whose heart donates, whose heart motivates them, which means that they make a decision to donate. And there are certain people who are considered halachically, medically incompetent, and their decisions cannot be considered valid decisions. And the deaf mute is one of them. The deaf mute is someone who was born deaf and never learned how to speak. If such a person were to be taught, that's a whole discussion in halacha. But right now, we're talking about a situation where this is the person, he's a deaf mute, he is considered mentally incompetent. And because of that, he was excluded from the verse that says that the donations towards the construction of the Mishkan had come from someone who donated, his heart motivated. He made a decision to do so, and they are not considered capable of making valid decisions. And therefore, they are excluded. Hashaita means a deranged person. So to a deranged person is considered mentally incompetent. Now, what exactly is the definition of a deranged person? So the way that the Yad Avraham brings down is one is considered deranged if on a regular basis and for no rational reason, he either wantonly destroys items of value that are given to him, give him something valuable, just chucks it away to be destroyed, goes out alone at night to an inhabited place, meaning he puts himself in danger, sleeps overnight in graveyards, or tears his clothes. These are actions that make a person, that define a person as deranged. That person was excluded, again, for the same reason as a deaf mute, he was excluded from donating towards the Mishkan, towards the construction of the tabernacle. He too is excluded from separating Truma. Then you have the Katan, the minor. Now, a minor is interesting because a minor, we also say, is not yet matured enough. His intellect, his or her intellect, depending if you're talking about a boy or a girl, their intellect, but actually talking about both a boy and a girl, their intellects, while they are still minors, is considered not fully developed and therefore not competent to make decisions that would have ramifications like donating towards the Mishkan, separating Truma. And we know that a girl becomes an adult at the age of 12 and a boy at the age of 13. And both of them actually have to not only reach the years of 12 and 13, they also have to have produced 2 pubic hairs. Now, what's interesting is that a Katan, we consider them, to a certain degree mentally incompetent. However, we know that at a certain age, like a year before Bar Bas Mitzvah, if the boy or the girl were to make a vow, and we would realize that they understand, and we would speak to them and realize they understand what they're doing, their vow would be a vow. So at a certain point, you can't say that they're incompetent because they have the competence to make a vow. And therefore, we actually need another verse, a different word in that, different words in that verse by the donation to the construction of the Mishkan that exclude Katan, because we're excluding even a minor who has already developed enough of a mental capacity to be able to affect things, to make a decision to affect things. And therefore, if we're going to say that he still can't affect Truma, then we have to have a separate source, which we do. There are words in that verse that exclude the minor from donating to the Mishkan, and therefore the same thing applies to separating Truma. The next part of the Mishnah, next example is if you separate Truma from what's not yours, you go over to somebody else's grain and you separate the grain from there. It's not yours to do. It's not yours to do. You're not able to go ahead and separate it. Now, what's interesting to note is the following, and that is that, number one, okay, you cannot go ahead and just walk over to someone else's grain and separate Shimmer from it. But if he appoints you as an agent, he tells you to do it for him, then there's no question that absolutely works. Not only that, right. Now, to go over to someone's grain and to basically take away, you're going to say, well, he has to separate Truma anyway, so, I'll just go and I'll just separate it for him. Well, again, you cannot do that unless he actually designates you. However, because again, taking away from his grain is to a certain degree a loss for him. Now, although he has to do it anyway, again, maybe it depends when he wants to do it, at a different time he wants to do it. You're going to taking away his grain. You don't have the power to do it, and you don't have the right to do it. Now, however, very important halacha to know. If, let's say, I have grain that is tevel, it is not yet, Truma hasn't been taken from it. So I'm going to be taking Truma from this grain for myself. And I decide not only will I take from my grain Truma for my grain, but I'll separate from my grain Truma for someone else's grain that needs Truma to be separated from. That works. So again, if I have grain that is tevel, Truma hasn't been separated from it, and I'm going to be separating Truma from it for myself. I mean, I could be separating Truma from it for myself. I could actually take from my tevel, from my grain that Truma hasn't been taken from, and separate from it for someone else's grain that doesn't have Truma yet taken from it. And there I can do it even without his permission. Because if I'm taking off Truma for him and there's no skin off his back, he doesn't have to give up anything from his grain for it. I'm going to give up from mine for it. Then that's called zechia. That's called doing something for someone's advantage, not in his presence. And the word is zaken sha'ad la'adam shaloi b'fanav. If let's say, if the halakha feels that doing this for someone is advantageous, then you can do it from even without telling him. Okay. Now, at the same time, so again, if I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to separate from my grain for him, I'm going to take from my grain truma for his grain. He has nothing to lose. He's only gaining. He's not even going to have to give up anything from his grain. Clearly, it's an advantage for him. I can do it without his permission. If for some reason we find out that he didn't want that done, then it's not going to work. That means for him personally, it wasn't an advantage. It's not going to work. But under regular circumstances, we can assume that such a thing is considered a benefit for him, and therefore you could do it for him. So again, if I am an agent of his, or I'm taking it from my grain for him, there's no problem doing it. But to walk over to his actual grain, which is not under my ownership, without being appointed to do so, my separating truma of his grain, even though he needs himself to do it himself, isn't going to work. And the last case is Oibed Kaychavim Shatarim Eshel Yisrael, the non-Jew who separated truma for Yisrael. The Mishnah points out, even if he was appointed, the non-Jew was appointed by the Jew to separate truma for him. Ein Trumas Truma doesn't work. Again, based on the verses by the donation towards the construction of the Mishkan, non-Jews were excluded, and so to here, it's a different verse. So I'm making a mistake. The verse that excludes a non-Jew from separating truma comes from a different verse, and therefore a non-Jew is excluded from separating truma, even if he's appointed. Even if he's appointed, a non-Jew is excluded from the whole ability to affect truma completely. A Jew has the ability to affect truma. Now the question is, but he can't do it if it's not his. He doesn't have the right to do it then. You can make him an agent. I do it for his advantage, then I can do it. But a non-Jew is completely excluded from the law of truma to affect truma, and therefore, even if he's appointed as a shliach, he's not going to be able to do it. Actually, there's also a rule that a verse that teaches us that you can't appoint a non-Jew as an agent. That's what the verse does. The verse, actually, it's a verse by when the Torah is discussing truma. There's words there that tell us that the person doing it for you has to be like you. So he's actually excluded from being your agent to be able to separate the truma. Okay, that is the end of that Mishnah. And now the Sefer HaMitzvot. Mitzvahs leisasher shulis asek bein malva l'leiva beribis. Here we're starting some of the prohibitions about against lending money with interest. And the first mitzvah is shulis asek bein malva l'leiva beribis, not to have any part in a loan, not to have any part, any kind of involvement with a lender and a borrower where interest is being arranged as part of this loan. Shenamar, as it says, you shall not put upon him interest. That means that wording, don't put upon him interest, which is going on the borrower, do not put upon him interest, is including that word, don't put upon him, means not to be involved at all in putting interest upon the borrower. V'hainu, what this means is, not to be a co-signer, not to be a witness. If you're a co-signer or a witness, you're facilitating the loan. You're facilitating the loan to take place. A loan takes place, you have a co-signer, you have witnesses, and that's how the loan takes place. Well, if you're doing that for a loan that the agreement there is to charge interest, then you're involved in that, and you're not allowed to do that. And of course, the lender himself, who is creating this condition of interest, is also included in this prohibition of do not put upon him interest. That's besides the specific prohibition that we're going to see not to lend the money. There's the specific prohibition about lending money with interest, and then there is the prohibition about being involved in a loan that has interest. Now, let's say there was a middleman. He arranged the loan between the two people. So again, he's just the arranger. He's just the middleman. He transgresses the prohibition of do not cause a stumbling block in front of someone, which is a prohibition that says don't cause someone to sin. Basically, if you know that the loan that's going to happen here is going to be a loan with interest, then if you arrange that loan, you may not be considered involved because you're not involved in the actual, so to speak, creating of the loan. It's like a cosigner or a witness, or the lender himself. Their involvement is much more an involvement in the actual loan itself. You just facilitated it. Nonetheless, you're transgressing the prohibition of facilitating a sin for someone to do, which is a prohibition of do not cause stumbling in front of a blind person, which we already mentioned, doesn't have to be in front of a blind person, and the stumbling means to cause them to sin. This applies in all places, at all times, both by men and by women. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.